Much for joining us on Economynext on this live stream on Facebook. We at Economynext want to cover this parliamentary general election by talking to as many people as possible, talking mainly to the politicians, the people who are on the front lines of the campaign at the hustings, so that you, the viewer, and our reader can get a good view of all the opinions and the proposals and the debates that are going on in the next few weeks. Today, we are very happy to welcome Mr. Eran Wickramaratne, a banker, now politician, deputy minister, and state minister. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
To start you talked about debt and the serious economic crisis that Sri Lanka is facing. If elected, what is your plan to pull us out of this mess? It's a combination of loss of revenue through apparels, tourism, and remittances, plus the general breakdown because of COVID. What is your plan?
I think that the post-COVID situation actually complicates the economics quite a bit. However, I think that the issues were also pre-COVID and then compounded by COVID. So the immediate issue is that how do you actually increase the cash. Broadly speaking, there are two roads. One road that the government tends to be following is the road on which you are looking more internally, right? And sometimes the language that is being used is, this is our great opportunity to develop our internal markets, internal businesses, production, this, that, and the other. The other road that we would take is really working with the international community and the international markets. Our immediate requirement is maybe $5-6 million of cash to be brought into the economy or company. Immediate issues. I think the immediate issues as a 2-year problem, I think we can probably see growth. I think formalize over the next 3 years. So we will research with our partners. We will work with countries, with India, with the US, with Japan, and so forth, our relationships. We'll work with the multilaterals, the World Bank, the ADB, with JICA, China and others. We have taken loans and so forth in trying to see how we could ease the debt burden, right? And also have an understanding, even with the International Monetary Fund, because that will also help us with improving our international ratings over time. So that would be one step that we immediately take and build confidence, right? So that we go down that road.
But this government is also doing that, isn't it? It's talking to the multilateral agencies. It is talking to India and to China. So what's the difference? What difference would you bring to the party?
Yeah, I mean, I welcome this government actually pursuing that, because if you look at the players in this government, apart from the president, who is really playing a direct role as politician now, all the people, all the faces are old faces. And given the track record in the past, right, they have not been able to do that successfully. They have pursued mistaken policies. So earlier we, for example, got GSP Plus back, which we didn't have due to the conflict. We had a ban on our fisheries exports. We got that back and kind of built on those relationships and then accessed markets. So if the government is doing that, I think it's a welcome sign. But the early indications are like JICA and the Japanese have expressed reservations on some of their programs and put a halt to some of their programs. Some of the other countries also, in which we have markets, particularly if you look at things like textiles, right, have also expressed some concern. And the concern is to do with economic policy. The question is understood in the global situation. Nobody could claim to have a complete answer. The roads you follow can differ in actually minimizing the impact of the post-COVID period.
Um, with regard to COVID, the pandemic itself, what is your opinion about how the government has handled it? From what we can see, that the death toll has been very low. We have seen that most of the clusters have been controlled, but everybody, including the government and the whole country, was surprised and quite alarmed about what happened at Kandakadu. What is your party's position on how the government has handled the crisis?
Yeah, job in the media and actually getting its story across of how well the situation has been managed. I think if you get back, I brought this issue about the epidemic in January, on the 24th of January in Parliament. And national issue asked the speaker for a few minutes, and he said this epidemic has come as far as Hong Kong. 25th January is the Chinese New Year. Visitors will be going all over the world. Sri Lanka should take some steps immediately in the control of this, including, he said, we are an island, and therefore, foreigners entering the island, tourists entering the island should be screened and so forth. But at that point, some responsible people laughed and scoffed at the remarks at that time in January. You see, so I think that, in my view, is if we acted in January, right, that we would have even had a lesser impact. And a case in point is Vietnam. Vietnam acted in January, and they have not had a in Vietnam. They have managed the crisis. Their economy hasn't suffered like our economy has. When I say this, sometimes people laugh at me as I say this, but I say this as responsibility. While we compare ourselves with countries which have very high death tolls, we never mention the fact that there are 11 islands in the world who haven't had a single death. Sri Lanka is an island also, and an island nation, if you act promptly and quickly, you could do it. Subsequently, came, which is people who know about epidemics, and that health specialists involved in this. So, in a sense, after there was an acceleration, then they brought it under control. Now the question, are we in a second wave, in this epidemic? So to answer your question, Arjuna, I can't be very specific. I think the main issue here is that do we trust the data? Do we trust the information coming out of the government? It's very that the British government published a list of countries in which they wouldn't be entertaining tourists or visitors from when they open their gates at their airports. And Sri Lanka was on the list. But then according to our government, we have had only about 2,600, 700 COVID or Corona patients, right? And they are, not allowing us to go in. And in contrast, a country like Singapore has had more than 45,000 Corona patients, but Singapore is not on the banned list. So I wonder why. So the trust issue is not just Sri Lanka. It looks like even the international community doesn't really trust all the data, the stories, and the narratives that are coming out of the Sri Lankan government.
Is there a reflection about the way this government acts, or is it just that we are just deeply suspicious as a people, or people who are outside just don't want to trust something that a country like ours, like a poor country like ours, has done?
I don't think we should be generalizing and putting ourselves, in the poor country bracket. I think, each country should build its international relationships. As we know, financial markets for sure work on trust. You see, financial markets work on trust. And if that is the case, then I would urge the government to build the trust. If you really believe that, your future lies in foreign investment, because local investment and saving ratios are low, we want higher living standards, so we want more people to invest. We have to attract the investment from overseas. Then we have to build the trust if that's the case. If we really think our living standards are dependent on not just our local market, but on the international markets, and we have to emphasize exports, and we have to send our goods and services overseas, we have to build the trust then in those countries and in those markets too. So as far as we are concerned, we are very clear of our direction and where we want to go, how we will go about it, how we will increase investment and markets. If they think otherwise, right, then I have a feeling that the consequences of the COVID will be there for a long time with us.
Your position, your party's position about the COVID and the election has been that it's better to postpone the election, but it's there, so we will campaign anyway. When you say postpone, the criticism that is coming to you saying, oh, they want to postpone the election, hoping that the two bits of the UNP will come back together. What is your response to that?
Our position on this was really that the government was irresponsible from the start, because it forced political parties to give their nominations list in March, right? That was very unfortunate that they did that, and immediately after that they locked down the country. So our position right at the beginning was, right, that this problem is far more complex than the government thinks. The people in this government, including the president, was involved basically in overcoming the terrorist threat in this country. You see, some problems you can win them by shooting, but health problems and economic problems can't be solved, you see, by shooting. They are far more complex, right? And you need lots of specialists and experts, in this field in actually handling this. So I think they are learning, but there's a consequence on how much time they are taking in actually learning this issue. So I am not very confident of really what this government is actually doing.
Just to go back, in October of 2018, when Mr. Eran Wickramaratne was sacked and Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa was appointed as Prime Minister, there was an outpouring of support. There was an outpouring of support for constitutionality, for democracy, and there was significant support. There were people who were very apolitical, who became political at that moment. And there was a lot of support for your party, for your government. Have you since then squandered that political capital that came out of nowhere in some ways? Have you squandered that since then?
Yeah, so going to your earlier question, our position earlier was that actually this problem is complex, and therefore the present parliament, right, should have sat continuously because it was elected for a 5-year period. And then the president would have certainly received the support of parliament, given the COVID situation was unprecedented. And if that was the case, parliament would have gone till August, elections would have come in November, and there was a much longer period in which the government could have easily handled the COVID situation. But they didn't hinder to that, and they came up with all kinds of excuses and basically created a lot of uncertainty, which won't help us economically. Now, your question as to whether we had squandered the goodwill that was there previously, right? I must say that I have to admit that there must be some truth in that, because the presidential election results, right, were not in our favor. However, having said that, like in every government, you have your successes and you have your weak points and your failures, and then it's how people actually perceive it. Our government certainly majored on the idea of freedom, on the idea of democracy, on the idea of rule of law, right? There are virtually no accusations, right? Particularly when it comes to things like freedom, even the media and so forth, right? There are no accusations of we try to harass journalists went missing, or journalists were killed, or anything like that during this period. We strengthened democracy. We gave citizens in this country the right to information, right? A right that Scandinavians have enjoyed for more than 200 years, but we actually gave it to them legally, bestowed it on the citizens of this country. Right? We brought in the 19th Amendment, right, to balance the powers of the president vis-a-vis the judiciary and parliament. Because to have good governance, these institutions must be independent one from the other. And therefore, the presidency, right, was basically put in some framework, and some checks and balances were put in and made more answerable to parliament. And so these were done at that time. And these were some of the good things that were done. So this government is trying to create a narrative, right, that this restricts in some way the use of executive power, and that it's somehow the connected development. I completely reject that idea. This is a government and this is a family that has been previously in power. This is a group of people who removed the Chief Justice of this country, right, summarily and very, very, very hastily, right, and therefore interfering with the judiciary. So there's a track record here which people need to be mindful of. Sri Lanka is a democracy, and Sri Lankan democracy has to prevail, and therefore checks and balances are needed. I think this idea that putting faith in an individual has failed our country for too long. We need to build frameworks, we need to have policies, and we need to build institutions. The presidency is an institution, so is parliament and the judiciary. And all these institutions must be strengthened. One must be independent from the other. The other day, I was horrified to see the president, call in the media, call central bank officials, the governors, senior deputy governors, and then question them in public, with the camera there, without realizing that central banks also are independent of government. Central banks have responsibilities, and those responsibilities, particularly stability of the financial system, control of inflation, these are best done independent of the government and fiscal policy. But so that's why I said there's a lack of understanding, or there's a deliberate attempt to actually scuttle independence. It's one of the two conclusions that one has to arrive at.
But the central bank did as the president wanted them to do, right? So was the president wrong, and did they knowingly do something wrong?
Yes, of course, because if the central bank, who has argued for its independence for so long, and being the former state minister for finance, I could say we've upheld that principle even when we disagreed with the central bank, and that you can check with any senior official of the central bank, right? But this is the issue, when authoritarianism raises its head, right, and independent public officials, right, must learn to stand up, whether they are in independent institutions, whether they are in commissions, or whether they are in the judiciary. If they really want, right, a democratic rule of law framework to remain and to be passed on to our children, right? Individuals come and go, people come and go, but institutions and frameworks must be built and strengthened for democracy.
Some would say that the desire for the demand of a strong person, the sort of shambolic or dysfunctional nature of your government when it was in power in the last 1.5 years or so. What do you think about that?
I would say that certainly democracies have some of their weaknesses, and one of the issues that did surface during our period is in a cohabitation situation which did not work very well, and the main responsibility lies with the former president and the former prime minister. Leaders need to figure out and work out things better, that's for sure, and I have no disagreement with that. But then to move away from that and then to think that the king will solve all our problems, we might as well go to a kingdom where the king is also the legislature and the king is also the judiciary. Now that's not acceptable in a modern society, in a modern democracy. So certainly the weaknesses need to be strengthened. It does not mean that you move from that into a very authoritarian regime. Look at the history of authoritarian regimes around the world. Right? Regimes which have also aligned all these authoritarian regimes with military power. Look at their history. So this is not something that I'm just speaking just in terms of just Sri Lanka. I'm just saying this at looking at international politics and the world around us. Which countries have in the long run actually progressed and prospered? It's countries which have largely built up rule of law. And which countries have actually given its average citizens more opportunity? It's democracies that have given the average citizens more opportunities. So that is why I'm saying, yes, there were failures during our period, but those must never be used as excuses, right, for creating regimes that could actually change our way of life and how citizens can actually fashion their way of life?
In the post-mortem of the presidential election, one of the main points that the people who supported Mr. Sajid Premadasa said was that the main party, that is the United National Party, did not support this candidate as much as it could. What has changed now? Now you've broken away from the UNP, taken most of the MPs, that sitting MPs are with you. So has that scenario changed? Do you think that there is a unity in this alliance?
Yeah, I would say, just going back to your reference to the United National Party, often these references of not having support and all are basically related to individuals and how individuals, have acted, or how have individuals, what they have said. And sometimes those have become the obstacles, in a journey, and that's very unfortunate that sometimes that kind of thing has happened. In politics, right, there is a democratic space, and in this Samagi Jana Balavegaya, certainly we want to create the democratic space where you could argue, have different viewpoints, debate it, and so forth. But finally, when the policy is agreed on, then we all have to back the policy. So I think internal democracy in political parties. Our democracies in our part of the world and in Sri Lanka are often defined as going once in 5 years and voting for an individual, and that's how we define democracy. But internal democracy in political parties is absent. On one side, we have a party which is dominated by a family. There is no internal democracy in that. On the other side, we have a party which is dominated by a clique. It's not a family. But there is no democracy. They can choose leaders, young people could actually aspire, and the older generation, through a democratic process, to be making way. That in the long run, you say, that will. I have a lot of faith in the next generation. I was born, we didn't have a mother, say 10 years on a waiting list to get a phone. All the neighbors after turned out to use the telephone. They put a tip telephone bill. But the next generation is born with a mobile. They have instant information. They know what's happening around the world. They are technology savvy, right? So we need to make sure we have political way people to come, should become, everybody has equal access. Not just the think through democracy.
Yes, thank you very much. One last question. That particular generation, that particular group that you were talking about, they are your new voters. They may be a floating vote at the moment. What message do you have for them?
What I would say is the SJB is not a traditional political party. We are a new force for a new generation, and we are looking for new people to come forward. Sri Lankan politics has been dominated for too long by families and political families everywhere you look at it. That's not stopping people from those political families coming on their own merits. I'm not against that. But certainly it should be a meritocracy. It should be based on merit. And we stand for that principle. And for younger people, one is we want you to join the political process, right? And we have created the space for you to join the political process. The other thing I would like to say is we also want to create more opportunities in the system for young people. We want every Sri Lankan young person to have a higher education. Those who can go to state universities, well and good, will expand the opportunity. Those who want to go to private universities and get an education, we want to provide you. We started in the last government by giving interest-free loans. We want to provide you the means to get that education. If you don't want to go to university, you want to get a technical education, we want you to get a vocational education. Every Sri Lankan to get a vocational education or a professional education. We are a small population in a very big continent, and we need to distinguish ourselves by our human resources. We have a locational advantage, but human resources has to be our next advantage. And for youth, we want to create that opportunity. We want to allow for new industries, information technology, the electronics industry. These are the next, if you want, the next garment industry in this country. We want to create those opportunities for these young people. We want to create a big opportunity for entrepreneurship. Sri Lanka's entrepreneurship is very low, 2.8% of the working population. Big countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand have 11%, 17%, more than 20% of entrepreneurs. We want to create that space for entrepreneurs. We want to put government money behind R&D. We want to put government money into capital markets funds so that younger people could actually take their ideas into big ventures. So we want to create opportunity for young.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for everybody who watched us on Facebook. And there'll be more interviews like that. And thank you very much, Mr. Wickremeratne, for joining us today.